Strong companies don't collapse when everything goes wrong. They collapse when everything seems right. No crisis, no warning, just a series of small, silent decisions that no one thought were dangerous. Have you ever stopped to think about why some of the strongest, most respected, and apparently most stable companies simply disappear without ever having gone through a major crisis? There was no scandal. There was no sudden financial collapse. There was no headline saying it's all over. And yet, when someone notices that company no longer exists in the way it did before, the question almost no one asks is, how can something strong fall without ever appearing weak? There's a comfortable narrative in the business world that says companies fail due to obvious mistakes, bad decisions, or unexpected crises. But this narrative is incomplete, and maybe even dangerous, because it makes us believe that as long as there is no chaos, there is no risk. As long as the numbers still add up, as long as the teams continue to work, as long as the customers still exist, everything is under control. And that's exactly where the quietest problem of all begins. Strong companies don't collapse when something explodes. They collapse when nothing explodes, when everything keeps working, when the routine remains intact, when the meetings still happen, the reports still come in, the goals still seem achievable. The absence of a crisis creates a deceptive sense of security, and this feeling is one of the biggest psychological traps within any organization. The silent collapse does not begin with an absurd decision. It starts with small choices that seem rational, with strategic postponements, with difficult conversations that wait until later, with signs that are noticed but not treated as urgent. None of this seems serious at the time it happens. On the contrary, it often seems prudent. It looks mature. It looks professional. And that's exactly why it goes unnoticed. A company's strength can become its biggest blind spot. Past results build confidence. Trust creates comfort, and comfort reduces the need to question. When something has worked for a long time, the human mind tends to believe that it will continue to work. Uncomfortable data is relativized. Warnings are interpreted as exaggeration. Market changes are seen as temporary. Everything seems justifiable when it still doesn't hurt. And here comes a central factor that is almost never discussed: human behavior. Companies don't make decisions. People take it, and people avoid discomfort. They avoid conflict. They avoid admitting that something needs to change before it is absolutely necessary. This psychological pattern is natural, but within organizations it is amplified. The larger the company, the easier it is to normalize small deviations. The more success, the greater the resistance to questioning the model itself. Collapse without crisis is a process of wear and tear. It is not visible from the outside, and it is often not noticed by those inside. It manifests itself in slowness, in the loss of agility, in the difficulty of adaptation, by repeating strategies that no longer work as well as they used to. None of this sets off immediate alarm bells, but all of this is, little by little, moving the company away from external reality. Perhaps the most disturbing thing is to realize that, when the collapse finally becomes evident, most of the decisions that led up to it are already behind us. The time to react has decreased. Options are more limited. Important people have already left. Trust has already been eroded, and what seems like a sudden fall was actually built slowly, decision after decision, in silence. If this idea has already caused you some discomfort, it's a good sign, because this type of collapse doesn't just happen in large corporations. It happens in teams, startups, careers, and personal projects, and understanding how it begins requires looking at what we normally ignore: excessive normality, prolonged comfort, and decisions that never seemed urgent. Stay with me until the end of this video, because from here, we will start to dismantle this process step by step. And if at some point you recognize patterns that you've seen up close, it's worth joining the conversation. This type of reflection only makes sense when it leaves the abstract and encounters the reality of those who are watching. Before we go even deeper into this topic, it's worth making a quick pause for something important. This type of content only makes sense when it becomes a conversation, not when it remains just an isolated reflection. If at any point so far you thought, "This has already happened where I worked," or "This describes exactly what I saw up close," I would love for you to leave this noted in the comments. You don't need to explain everything. Sometimes a simple sentence says a lot. You can comment something like, "Everything seemed normal. No one thought it was serious," or even, "I've seen a company like that." that the comments help to show how much more common this pattern is than it seems. Leaving a like also makes a real difference, not as an automatic gesture, but as a sign that this type of analysis, deeper, more psychological, less superficial, deserves to continue appearing. The algorithm understands this as relevance, and this allows this content to reach other people who may not have stopped to think about how companies actually collapse without ever experiencing a visible crisis. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, consider subscribing now. The videos here are not about quick formulas, nor about obvious stories of success or failure. They are about what happens behind the scenes, human decisions, psychological patterns, silent errors, and slow processes that almost no one notices while they are happening. If this subject interests you, subscribing ensures that you continue to follow this type of analysis in depth. From here, let's move away from the general idea and into the actual mechanism behind this type of collapse. Let's understand how normality becomes a trap, how success changes internal behavior, and why strong companies often lose the ability to react precisely when they still seem to be in control. It is at this point that decisions stop being isolated events and start to form a pattern. And it is exactly this pattern that we need to observe carefully from now on. Everything seems normal, and that's exactly what makes this moment so dangerous. There are no sirens, there is no panic, there are no emergency meetings. Companies continue to operate, earn revenue, hire, and deliver results considered acceptable. The numbers are not scary. Goals are still achieved, even if with more effort than before. From the outside, nothing attracts attention. Inside, the routine remains intact. And when routine remains, the human mind interprets this as security. Excessive normality creates a silent trap. When everything seems to work, there is no sense of urgency. And without urgency, there's no pressure to question decisions, review strategies, or confront uncomfortable truths. The brain associates stability with health, even when that stability is only superficial. It is at this stage that strong companies begin to weaken without realizing it, not because of incompetence, but because of comfort. Meetings continue to take place at the same times, with the same agendas, led by the same people. Reports come in with numbers that aren't great, but also aren't bad enough to raise alarm. Good enough results are now treated as proof that the model still works. Small drops are justified as normal fluctuations. Small delays become acceptable exceptions. Small complaints are seen as noise. Nothing seems serious in isolation, and precisely for this reason, nothing is treated as a priority. This is the point at which the absence of a crisis begins to be confused with a sign of health. The company is not growing like it used to, but it is not falling either. It's stable, and stability sounds safe. The problem is that stability without adaptation is just accumulated delay. The market continues to change. Customer behavior evolves. Competition adjusts. But internally, the feeling is that there is still time. Time to observe another quarter. Time to wait another cycle. Time to not mess with what still seems to work. The psychology behind this is simple and dangerous. Humans avoid discomfort. Questioning a system that appears to work requires emotional energy, conflict, and risk. As long as there is no explicit pain, the natural impulse is to maintain what already exists. Within companies, this behavior is amplified by structures, roles, and expectations. Questioning too much can be interpreted as negativity. Raising alerts may seem like overkill, and so, normality becomes a value to be protected. The most disturbing thing is that this stage is often interpreted as organizational maturity. Processes are defined. Decisions are made carefully. Changes are made in a slow and controlled way. Everything looks professional. Everything seems under control. But behind this appearance, there is a critical detail. The company is reacting less to the external environment and more to its own internal routine. Reality begins to be filtered by normality. When results are just enough, they anesthetize. They're not exciting, but they're not scary either. And this creates a psychological space where difficult decisions are constantly postponed. Why move now, if you can still wait? Why generate internal tension if nothing is broken? Why confront an old strategy if it still delivers something? Each of these questions seems reasonable. Each of these pushes the organization a little further away from adaptation. The false sense of security is born exactly from this fragile balance. Nothing explodes, so nothing seems to require immediate action. The problem is that silent meltdowns don't start when something goes wrong. They start when everything continues to work, even if less and less efficiently. The company moves forward but loses sensitivity, loses speed. You lose the ability to notice subtle changes before they become too obvious. At this point, signals already exist, but are not interpreted as threats. They are treated as details, like exceptions, like specific problems. The absence of a visible crisis creates the illusion of control, and this illusion is reinforced daily by the repetition of the routine. The more normal everything seems, the harder it becomes to admit that something needs to change. After all, change in a seemingly stable environment seems risky, and not changing feels safe. This is how strong companies enter the most dangerous phase of all. Not when they are weak, not when they are in crisis, but when they are too comfortable to feel that something is wrong. The absence of urgency does not mean the absence of risk. It just means that the risk has not yet become impossible to ignore. And when that happens, the cost is much higher. This stage does not generate fear. It generates accommodation, and accommodation creates distance between what the company believes to be its reality and what is actually happening outside of it. The longer this distance is maintained, the more silent decisions are made to preserve a sense of normality. And it is exactly at this point that the process begins to deepen, shaping internal behaviors in a way that is rarely perceived at the time it happens. From here, we need to look more closely at what this normality does to people within the organization, how past success begins to influence present decisions, how confidence slowly turns into rigidity, and how, without a visible crisis, strong companies start heading towards a collapse that no one believes is possible, until it is too late. After everything seems to be working and normality sets in as standard, a second movement begins to happen almost imperceptibly. Past success begins to silently influence all present decisions, not consciously, not as explicit arrogance, but as a psychological filter. The company looks back and sees victories, growth, recognition, and these memories begin to weigh more than the current signals. The past becomes an argument. History becomes a shield. When something has worked for a long time, the human mind tends to transform experience into certainty. Strategies that worked are no longer critically analyzed and are treated as consolidated truths. Decisions that were previously questioned are now automatically replicated. There is an implicit confidence that the model is too solid to fail without a major external event. And this trust creates a specific kind of blindness, the inability to notice that the context has changed, even when the signs are there. This is the time when leaders start to listen less and conclude faster, not because they don't care, but because they believe they've seen this movie before. Uncomfortable feedback is reinterpreted in light of past experience. Data that confirms beliefs receive attention. Data that challenge the dominant narrative are relativized, postponed, or explained as exceptions. The company does not ignore information. It reorganizes it in a way that preserves the feeling of control. Excessive confidence does not manifest itself in grandiose speeches. It appears in simple sentences, said naturally. This has always been like this. We've been through something similar. It's not that serious. Let's observe a little more. Each sentence seems reasonable in isolation. The problem is the accumulated effect. Curiosity wanes. The questioning weakens. The willingness to try something different is reduced. The organization begins to operate within an increasingly narrow field of possibilities. At this stage, disagreeing starts to require more emotional effort. Not because there is explicit repression, but because the environment values consensus and predictability. Ideas that challenge the current path create discomfort. Warnings sound like pessimism. Questions are seen as noise. Little by little, people learn to adjust what they say, how they say it, and when they say it. Not to lie, but to not cause unnecessary friction. And so, the silence begins to expand. Prolonged success also alters risk perception. Known risks are treated as manageable. New risks are seen as unlikely. The company begins to protect itself more from error than from stagnation. The fear of making mistakes outweighs the fear of being left behind. This shift is subtle but profound. It changes the logic of decisions. Instead of asking, "What do we need to do to stay relevant?" the question becomes, "How do we avoid compromising what we have already built?" This move seems prudent, but it carries a pitfall. Protecting what exists requires stability. Stability requires control. Control reduces flexibility. And in rapidly changing environments, flexibility is survival. The company remains strong on the outside, but is starting to harden on the inside. The ability to adapt, which was responsible for the initial success, begins to be lost precisely because the success happened. Another silent effect of overconfidence is a reduction in real listening. Important conversations become shorter. Deep discussions are replaced by quick alignments. There is less room for doubt and more room for validation. The role of meetings changes. They stop being places of exploration and become moments of confirmation. And when confirmation becomes an objective, the truth is no longer a priority. This is a critical point because the company still does not feel enough pain to change. Results keep coming. The market still responds, customers still exist. Everything seems to indicate that confidence is justified. But beneath this surface there is a growing delay between external reality and internal perception. The organization begins to react more slowly to changes, not because you can't, but because you don't believe you need to. Trust, which should be a resource, begins to turn into an obstacle. It reduces urgency. It reduces curiosity. It reinforces old patterns in a new setting. And the most dangerous thing, it causes silent decisions to continue being made without internal resistance. Each postponement seems logical. Every conservative choice feels responsible. And so, the path to crisis-free collapse continues to be paved. It is from here that the process gains invisible speed. Because when trust is consolidated as the main filter, decisions stop being isolated events and begin to form a pattern that is difficult to perceive while still appearing rational, a pattern that strengthens with each cycle of normality. And it is exactly this pattern that we need to observe in the next point, where small decisions begin to accumulate and produce effects that no one can ignore anymore. When excessive trust has shaped internal behavior and normality has become a value to be protected, decisions begin to change in nature. They stop being big strategic choices and start to manifest themselves as small, almost invisible daily actions. These are not decisions that attract attention. These are decisions that go unnoticed. Minimal adjustments, subtle postponements, slightly shifted priorities. And it is precisely this subtlety that makes the process so dangerous. At this stage, nothing seems wrong enough to warrant significant change. A project is postponed because it's not yet the ideal time. A difficult conversation is postponed because it's not worth generating friction now. A recurring problem is treated as an exception because it has always existed. Each choice seems reasonable in isolation. Each has a logical explanation. And precisely because of this, no one notices that a pattern is forming. The error is not in a specific decision, but in the constant repetition of the same logic. Waiting a little longer. That little more turns into weeks, then months, then years. Time starts to be treated as an ally when in fact, it is being wasted. The more time you save by avoiding a difficult decision, the more expensive it becomes when it finally needs to be made. But this cost does not appear immediately. It accumulates in silence. Human psychology directly contributes to this. The brain tends to underestimate long-term effects and overvalue immediate comfort. Solving a problem now creates discomfort. Postponing generates relief. This relief works as positive reinforcement. The mind learns that avoiding difficult decisions reduces tension in the short term. Within companies, this mechanism is amplified by structures that reward apparent stability. As long as the numbers don't plummet, everything seems justifiable. Over time, the organization begins to operate under a logic of accumulation. Unresolved small problems add up. Adjustments that should have been made early turn into complex reforms. What previously required adaptation now requires disruption. And breakups are always more difficult because they involve fear, resistance, and loss of control. The more decisions are postponed, the less room for future maneuver becomes. Another critical aspect of this process is the dilution of responsibility. Because decisions are small and distributed over time, no one feels directly responsible for the final effect. Each person participated in a fragment. Each choice felt right at the time it was made. The collective result, however, begins to point in a direction that no one consciously planned. Failure, when it arises, seems to have no author. This dilution creates an AM environment where it is difficult to identify the exact moment when something started to go wrong. There is no clear inflection point. There is just a sequence of choices that push the company slowly into a zone of rigidity. The organization continues to move, but always in the same direction. Movement gives the illusion of progress when in fact there is only continuity. As these small decisions accumulate, the company loses agility. Processes slow down. Responses to the market take longer. The ability to experiment diminishes, not because there is a lack of talent or resources, but because the room for error has been reduced by past choices. The more delays, the more fear of making mistakes. The more fear of making mistakes, the less action. And so, inertia sets in. The most dangerous thing is that this inertia is not perceived as a problem. It is interpreted as caution, like maturity, like responsibility. The company believes it is being prudent when in fact it is just distancing itself from external reality. Changes in the market continue to happen, but they are absorbed slowly, filtered through internal processes that no longer keep up with the pace of the outside world. At this point, the organization begins to confuse planning with paralysis. Discussions are repeated, analyses deepen, but decisions do not materialize. There is a lot of thinking and little action, and meanwhile, more agile competitors advance, not because they are smarter, but because they make decisions sooner. The strong, confident, and experienced company begins to fall behind without realizing it. These small decisions don't scream, they whisper. They do not cause crises. They create wear and tear. A wear and tear that erodes the internal structure of the organization, while everything still seems to work. And when the wear and tear finally becomes visible, it is no longer the result of a recent choice, but of an entire history of normalized postponements. It is exactly at this point that the signs begin to appear more frequently, not as clear warnings, but as inconsistencies, small deviations, indicators that no longer align perfectly. And this is where we enter the next phase of the process, the moment when signals exist but are no longer treated as signals. They start to be interpreted as noise. And this is where silence becomes even more dangerous. When small postponed decisions have already created inertia, and the organization begins to move slower than the environment around it, the signals begin to appear more clearly. They do not appear all at once, nor with the force of a definitive warning. They appear as occasional discomforts, small inconsistencies, numbers that no longer speak so well to each other, complaints that are repeated with different words. Delays are no longer the exception. None of this, in isolation, seems enough to raise alarm, and that is exactly where the danger lies. At this stage, the signals are not ignored. They are reinterpreted. The organization continues to see everything, but begins to explain everything in a way that preserves the feeling of normality. A negative data becomes statistical noise. A recurring criticism becomes a specific customer profile. A drop in engagement becomes a market phase. Each explanation seems logical. Each narrative seems plausible. And little by little, the signs stop provoking action and start to provoke justifications. The human brain seeks coherence. He prefers to adjust his interpretation of reality rather than accept that reality demands change. In organizational environments, this mechanism is reinforced by clear incentives. Those who question too much generate discomfort. Whoever maintains stability is seen as trustworthy. Thus, information that confirms the dominant narrative gains space, while information that challenges it is softened, postponed, or simply loses priority. Over time, this filtering becomes institutionalized. Reports now highlight what works. Problems appear in footnotes. Alerts arrive accompanied by reassuring explanations. The company remains well-informed, but increasingly less aware. There is information, but it lacks impact. There is data, but there is a lack of urgency. The system learns to absorb signals without reacting to them. This is a critical moment because silence stops being just the absence of noise and becomes learned behavior. People begin to realize that raising certain points does not generate change, only wear and tear. Then they adjust the speech. Legitimate concerns are no longer shared. Ideas that could provoke reflection are saved, not out of explicit fear, but out of emotional economy. No one wants to be seen as the problem in an environment that values the appearance of control. The organization enters a state of gradual anesthesia. Problems no longer shock. Inconsistencies become familiar. What would previously cause unrest is now treated as part of the scenery. And the more familiar something becomes, the less attention it receives. The company continues to operate, but with reduced sensitivity. She notices less, react less, learn less. Another effect of this process is the constant delay between perception and action. Even when someone recognizes that something needs to change, the decision is pushed until later. We will observe another cycle. Let's wait for the next quarter. We will collect more data. The search for perfect confirmation replaces the need to act, and while the organization waits for absolute certainty, the external environment continues to transform. This dynamic creates a growing distance between external reality and the internal narrative. From the outside, customers perceive failures more clearly, partners feel instability, competitors adjust faster. From the inside, everything still looks manageable. There is no crisis. There is no panic. There is no reason for drastic decisions. And so the company begins to always react one step behind. Ignoring signs is not a one-time decision. It's a habit that you build. Each time an alert is relativized, it becomes easier to relativize the next one. Each time a worry is postponed, the postponement becomes more acceptable. This pattern creates a silent spiral, where the organization progressively moves away from reality without realizing it. When reality finally sets in, the ability to react is already compromised. At this point, many still believe they are being prudent, strategic, and rational. Slowness is confused with caution. Inaction is seen as intelligent waiting. But the cost of this behavior does not appear in the reports. Lost time is not measured. Trust that erodes is not easily visible. And so, the company continues to accumulate ignored signals, believing that there is still room to correct course when necessary. It is from here that the process changes in quality. Because when signals are constantly reinterpreted as noise, the organization begins to protect itself from truth rather than risk. And this makes room for the next phase, where psychological comfort stops being a consequence and becomes a deliberate strategy. This is when excessive control and rigidity begin to look like solutions, not symptoms. When the signals have already been reinterpreted, relativized, and absorbed without generating a reaction, the organization enters an even more subtle and dangerous phase. Psychological comfort stops being just a consequence of past success and starts to actively guide decisions, not in a declared way but as an invisible criterion. The implicit question is no longer what do we need to do to remain relevant, and becomes how do we avoid destabilizing what still seems under control. At this moment, preserving the feeling of control becomes a priority, and to preserve control, the company begins to tighten structures. Decisions move up the hierarchy. Approvals multiply. Processes become more rigid. The justification is always rational. Reduce risk, ensure alignment, avoid errors. But the real effect is different. The more control you concentrate, the slower the organization becomes. The slower it is, the less able it is to react to the unexpected. Excessive control creates a powerful illusion. For those at the top, everything seems to be closely monitored. Nothing happens without validation. No decision is made without analysis. This creates the feeling of total control of the situation. But this domain is superficial because the information that reaches the center is already filtered. Problems are smoothed over. Bad news is edited out. Discomfort is diluted throughout the hierarchy before reaching decision makers. At the same time, perfectionism begins to gain ground. Projects are postponed because they are not ready yet. Changes are postponed because they don't seem completely safe. The search for optimal decisions replaces the need for timely decisions. In rapidly changing environments, this is fatal. Time becomes the organization's most wasted resource even without anyone realizing it. This perfectionism also changes team behavior. When everything has to go through strict filters, people take fewer risks. Bold ideas are saved. Suggestions that deviate from the standard are no longer presented. The environment becomes predictable, but poor in innovation. The organization starts to value conformity more than adaptation. Making mistakes becomes more dangerous than standing still. In the short term, this strategy appears to work. Conflicts decrease. The feeling of order increases. The company seems more organized, more mature, more professional. But this order is fragile. It depends on the constant maintenance of structures that do not keep up with the speed of the external world. The more the company tries to control everything, the less prepared it is to deal with real changes. Another silent effect of this stage is the loss of autonomy. People who previously resolved problems quickly now need to ask for authorization. Simple adjustments turn into long processes. The distance in between noticing a problem and acting on it grows. And the greater that distance, the harder it becomes to correct course when something actually goes wrong. The organization begins to operate as a closed system. She responds more to her own rules than to the external environment. What matters is no longer the impact on the market. but internal alignment. It is no longer quick adaptation, but compliance with the process. And meanwhile, lighter, less perfectionist and more error-tolerant competitors advance. The central paradox of this stage is that all of this is done in the name of security. Excessive control is born from the fear of losing what has been built. But by trying to protect too much, the company becomes rigid. And rigidity in an unstable environment is fragility. The organization strengthens itself internally against small mistakes, but weakens externally against large changes. At this point, abandoning this model becomes extremely difficult. Excessive control becomes part of the company's identity. Questioning it seems irresponsible. Loosening it seems risky. Even when results start to worsen, the natural response is to tighten even more. More control, more validations, more filters. And just like that, the trap closes. It is in this environment that collapse stops being just a distant possibility and starts to become a consequence. Not because something exploded, but because the organization lost the ability to move quickly. And when she finally needs to react, she discovers that the system she built to protect herself is exactly what prevents her from changing. From here, the process enters its final phase, not with a dramatic event, but with a gradual emptying. People start leaving, external trust erodes, relevance decreases, and the collapse happens without a crisis, without a headline, and without a clear moment of rupture. This is what we need to look at next. When rigidity is already in place and excessive control starts to define how the company works, the collapse does not happen in a spectacular way. It starts as an emptying, not something that catches your attention immediately, but something that you feel little by little. Key people begin to leave without fanfare. There are no major public conflicts, just discreet shutdowns. Experienced professionals, who previously questioned, suggested, and provoked reflection, begin to move away emotionally before even leaving physically. Energy decreases. The initiative weakens. The company continues to operate, but it no longer has the same pulse. This emptying is one of the clearest signs that something profound has changed, but it is rarely treated as such. Outputs are justified as personal decisions, new opportunities, natural cycles, and they often are. The problem is the pattern. When departures begin to repeat themselves, when talents stop being replaced by people with the same level of impact, when accumulated knowledge begins to disperse, the organization loses something that does not appear in spreadsheets: memory, context, and sensitivity. At the same time, relationships with customers and partners begin to deteriorate in an almost invisible way. There are no sudden breaks. There are small delays, poorly explained adjustments, promises partially fulfilled. Communication becomes more defensive, less transparent. The company starts to explain more and solve less. For those on the inside, everything still seems manageable. For those on the outside, something starts to sound different. Confidence doesn't disappear all at once. It wears out. At this stage, many leaders believe the problem is operational. All you need to do is reorganize teams, review processes, or adjust goals. Few can see that the collapse is no longer technical, but psychological and structural. The company lost the ability to adapt quickly because it built a system that prioritizes control, predictability, and internal comfort over response to the external environment. The most dangerous thing is that the collapse does not create immediate urgency. It manifests as a sequence of small losses, opportunities that do not materialize, contracts that are not renewed, customers choosing alternatives. Every loss seems explainable. Each can be attributed to external factors. And precisely because of this, none of them generate the feeling that something needs to change radically now. The organization enters a state of functional denial. There is constant activity. Meetings are held. Plans are presented. Indicators are analyzed. There is a lot of movement, but little real transformation. The company keeps busy, but does not reposition itself. She tries to preserve what's left instead of rebuilding what she's lost. And the longer it remains in this state, the more difficult it becomes to reverse the process. Another silent sign of this phase is the change in internal language. Words like resumption, restructuring, and alignment are starting to appear more frequently. But these words are rarely accompanied by profound changes in behavior. They work more like an aesthetic than as a cure. The narrative changes, but decisions continue to be made in the same way. The pattern repeats itself under new names. Meanwhile, on the outside, the company's relevance diminishes. It ceases to be a reference. Stop being cited. Stop being remembered. Not because he did something obviously wrong, but because he failed to do something relevant at the right time. The market does not announce this departure. He just moves on. This type of meltdown is especially insidious because it doesn't feel like a meltdown while it's happening. For those inside, the feeling is one of surprise when everything finally becomes clear. For those who observe the process closely, the outcome was predictable for a long time. The difference between these two perceptions lies precisely in the silence that accumulated along the way. This is where the process approaches the end point. Not an abrupt ending, but a belated recognition. When the company begins to realize that it has not only lost results, but the ability to react. That the problem was not an isolated mistake, but an ongoing pattern of silent decisions. And it is at this moment that the most difficult question of all arises, the one that is almost never asked while there is still time. It is this question that we need to face in the next and final point, where the collapse stops being just organizational and becomes clearly human. When the company finally begins to realize that something has been lost, the impact is no longer just strategic or operational. He is human, not in the shallow emotional sense, but in behavior, in the way decisions are avoided, justified, and repeated. At this point, many are still looking for a specific error to point out, a wrong choice, a project that failed, a leader who left. But this search almost always ends in frustration because there is no single moment of rupture. What exists is a pattern, a predictable, silent, and widely repeated human pattern. The uncomfortable truth is that strong companies don't collapse because someone decided to destroy everything. They collapse because no one decided to stop the process while it still seemed to work. Every decision was defensible at the time it was made. Each postponement seemed reasonable. Each justification sounded logical. And precisely because of this, no one felt they were making a serious mistake. Failure did not come from an absurd choice, but from the sum of comfortable choices. At this stage, it becomes clear that the problem was never just about the market, competition, or technology. The problem was the way human beings deal with uncertainty, discomfort, and loss of control. There is a natural resistance to admitting that something needs to change before the pain becomes explicit. As long as there is movement, it is believed that there is progress. As long as there is no crisis, it is believed that there is no risk. This belief underpins the entire cycle of silent collapse. Another central aspect here is the dilution of responsibility. As decisions were small, gradual, and distributed over time, no one feels directly responsible for the final result. There are no clear villains. There are no spectacular errors. There is just an entire system that has learned to avoid tension. And systems that avoid tension tend to preserve patterns even when they no longer work. Right now, many organizations are trying to reinvent the narrative. They talk about repositioning, transformation, a new phase. But without addressing the psychological root of the problem, these attempts tend to repeat exactly the same behaviors under different names. The language changes, the slides change, speeches change, but decisions continue to be postponed. The signals continue to be relativized. Comfort continues to be prioritized. The most disturbing thing is to see how this pattern repeats itself in different contexts, sectors, and company sizes. This is not a problem exclusive to large corporations. It appears in startups, small teams, individual projects, and even careers, whenever normality is confused with security. Whenever silence is treated as maturity, whenever the absence of a crisis is interpreted as proof that everything is fine, this is the point at which the collapse stops being a surprise and becomes a consequence. Not something that happened suddenly, but something that built slowly. The company didn't just lose results, she lost sensitivity, lost agility. He lost the ability to realize when he needed to act before acting became too expensive. And perhaps the most uncomfortable part of all of this is recognizing that this process is deeply human. It's not a lack of intelligence. It's not a lack of information. It's the difficulty of breaking patterns while they still seem safe. It's the tendency to protect what exists instead of questioning whether it still makes sense. As long as this logic is not interrupted, the cycle tends to repeat itself, even after significant falls. This is where reflection needs to remain open. Why understand why strong companies collapse without crisis is not just about business. It's about behavior, about silent decisions, about what we choose not to face while it still feels too soon, until it becomes too late to ignore. If this made sense to you, leave it on record. In the comments, write something like silent collapse, no one noticed, or this is repeated. If you've made it this far, leave a like as a sign that this type of analysis deserves to continue. And if you're not already subscribed, consider subscribing to follow content that explores exactly these invisible patterns that shape decisions before the results appear. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this video really hit you. Maybe not as entertainment, but as recognition. This type of content is not made for quick consumption. It is made for those who observe patterns, reflect, and notice what the majority ignores. If this made sense to you, consider subscribing to the channel. Not out of habit, but because the next videos continue to explore exactly this invisible territory of business. Silent decisions, human failures, and the psychological processes that destroy companies long before any crisis appears. If at any point you thought about a company, a leader, or a real situation that you have already witnessed, leave this recorded in the comments. You can comment something simple like, "Everything seemed normal," "The silence was deceiving," or "I've seen this happen." These comments show that this pattern is not theoretical, it is lived. And if you made it to the end, leave a like. Not in support of the video, but as a sign that this type of in-depth analysis still has a place. Because as long as silent decisions continue to be made, stories like this will continue to repeat themselves.